What's going on today? We're going to walk through the process of taking an Axial SCX10-II and converting it over to the new Vanquish VS4-10 chassis kit. Today we've got these two Axial SCX10-II Blazers on the table. Now, this one here is my Axial SCX10-II Blazer, which I ran this summer, but since then I haven't really ran it a lot. It just wasn't the truck that I found myself wanting to drive the most, and it's just been kind of sitting on the shelf collecting dust, really. Now, next to it here, we've got another 69 Blazer, which looks very similar from the outward appearance. However, this one has already been converted over and is running the new Vanquish VS4-10 chassis kit. Now, I did an assembly video of the VS4-10 chassis kit and went through the steps that it takes to assemble it to the point that we've got here. What we're going to do today is we're going to take my stock Axial SCX10-II and we're going to convert it over to the new chassis setup. We're going to install all of the stock suspension components into this chassis, walking through each of the steps. A new drag link and panhard are included, as they're a couple millimeters longer than the stock version, so we're going to use those new included links, and we're just going to go through the rest of the steps that it takes to convert the rolling chassis over to this one. The bumper mounts on this VS4-10 chassis are spaced the exact same as an SCX10-II, so you can take your standard 43mm post style bumpers and just bolt them right into the chassis. So in this case, you could take the stock bumpers off and bolt them right into the chassis, like you see has already been done on this version here. If you already have aftermarket bumpers on that either use post style or bolt to the outside of the chassis, those are going to work as well. The bolt spacing on the outside of the chassis is the same as an SCX10-II, so you should be able to use almost any bumper that you've already been using on this chassis kit. A number of different body post options are included with the kit. They're going to be in slightly different positions from the factory ones, especially with the Axial SCX10-II Blazer, which has an extended rear body mount. But for the most part, there should be an option included in the chassis kit so that you can mount that body in place on the new chassis. In this case, I'm going to be taking my Blazer and swapping it over, but I'm not going to carry over the body or the bumpers from this one because I want to change it up. I'm going to go with a little bit more performance oriented body, but I'm going to keep the 12-inch wheelbase that this chassis already had. It's just an opportunity to take a vehicle that I already had just sitting on the shelf that I didn't find myself driving as much and refresh it and turn it into something that I'm truly going to enjoy. In the assembly video for this chassis kit, I already installed a servo, so we're gonna skip that specific portion of the conversion, but everything else we're gonna pretty much walk you through. So let's get started by beginning the teardown of this Axial SCX10-II. Let's begin this process by removing the body and setting it aside. Before this video, I had already installed a new transmission in this vehicle with a brushless system, and because of that brushless system, I ended up having to put in a set of steel incision drive shafts. So I'm going to be swapping those over as well, and they're basically going to come out of this vehicle and into the new vehicle in the exact same way that a stock version would. So just note that I am using upgraded parts, but the installation process is still going to go exactly the same. I'm gonna do one axle at a time. So I'm gonna start by removing the front axle. First thing we're going to do is remove the upper shock mounts. And again, since we already installed a servo into the chassis kit in the last video, I'm not going to actually remove this servo. I'm just going to remove the drag link from the servo horn. I'm going to remove the panhard mount from the axle side since we're not going to reuse that. And then I'm going to remove the 3 screws holding the links to the skid plate. So now our whole front axle assembly is free and we can set that aside. Next, we're going to move to the rear of the chassis. Again, I'm going to start by removing the upper shock mount first. Now we need to remove the 4 screws holding the rear suspension to the skid plate. And now our rear suspension is free. On the bottom of the chassis, we need to remove the 4 screws holding the transmission into place. Lastly, I'm going to remove this receiver box lid and pull out my receiver since I'm going to transfer that to the new vehicle. If you do plan to reuse your bumpers, remove the 2 set pins in each bumper mount. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a new drag link and panhard included. So we need to pull off this drag link so that we can install the new one when installing this axle into the chassis. So now we have our front and rear axles with suspension components as well as our transmission. We can grab the new VS4-10 chassis kit and start to assemble all of the items. So here we have the assembled chassis kit. Now during the video where I showed actually assembling this, I installed the included pivot balls into the skid plate. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and remove all 8 of these, and I'm going to install them into the stock axial plastic rod ends so that they fit properly in this skid plate, and it will replace the plastic stock pivot balls with a nice metal one. Normally you would not have installed these in the skid plate like I did, but to try and keep the videos separated, that was the process. So I'm going to get these removed and get them installed into those factory rod ends. With the new metal pivot balls installed to the chassis side of the suspension links, we're now going to put the front axle into the chassis. It's usually easiest to start by installing the upper links first, then followed by the lower links. Since you'll only be installing 3 suspension links to the skid plate side of the VS4-10 chassis, the additional extra pivot ball that's included can be used as a spacer in the other spot on the upper link side. Now I'm going to install the new panhard link onto the axle side, reusing the factory hardware. Then I'm going to install the drag link onto the knuckle. Now we can install the factory shocks into the new shock towers. The VS4-10 shock towers mount the upper shock side in double shear, and it turns at 90 degrees. So if you're running the reservoir cap on your shocks, depending on your setup, you may run into clearance issues. So you can either swap to the non-reservoir style cap that is usually included in the parts bag, or you can simply cut it off as there is no functional passageways through there. In my case, rather than rebuilding factory shocks, I'm just going to remove that outside reservoir. And if you decided to cut and you don't want to look at the actual cut line, you can either file it, or you can simply flip the shock 180 degrees and you'll never see it. So now with the front axle installed into the VS4-10 chassis kit, you can start to see how much more suspension travel you'll be able to get out of this chassis. And now at this point, we're going to move on to the rear suspension. And again, we're going to start with the upper links first. Then we're going to flip the lower links into place. Now this time in the rear, before installing the shocks onto the shock towers, I'm going to go ahead and clip those reservoirs off again. And then we're going to install the shocks into the new shock towers. And now we have a rolling chassis. We need to drop the transmission in and hook up the drive shafts. And now we're going to bolt the transmission into the skid plate, but make sure to use the hardware that was included with the chassis kit rather than your stock hardware. The stock hardware may be different length versus the equal length hardware that is provided with the VS4-10 chassis kit. So now we've basically converted our old SCX10-II over to a new VS4-10 layout. We've got more suspension travel, both front and rear. We've got a scale style fuel cell. We've got a servo winch mounting position, an aluminum battery tray, and electronic mounting positions. We also have adjustable link geometry positions if you'd like to play around with that a little bit. Now the chassis kit comes with a universal slider style option. So if you didn't have a rock slider on the vehicle that you transferred over from, now you'll have an option. The outer portion of the rock slider on the VS4-10 chassis kit is different than an axial style, so you won't be able to transfer over a stock style outer portion of a rock slider. If you have aftermarket SCX10-II link sets, those will bolt into this setup exactly the same as we just showed. Again, the only thing that may differ is the length of the panhard and drag link, which are included. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not going to take my stock axial SCX10-II Blazer body and move it over to this new VS4-10 chassis. Instead, rather than having the big body with the long hangover and things like that, I'm going to go with more of a performance-oriented body. And my plan is to use this Proline Bronco body. Now this one comes with a plastic cage. However, I had this cage here, which was made by UC Fab, which bolts into the positions of that Bronco cage exactly like their plastic version is supposed to. So this is my plan to use on this. Now this body has a deep molded interior, and I really want to get this body really low onto this chassis. The VS4-10 chassis has a lot of travel, and I want to try and keep it nice and low, really take advantage of a low center of gravity with a ton of suspension travel still. And while I'm going through the effort of putting on a new body and really changing up the look, the tires and wheels from the stock Blazer are definitely going to have to go as well. So I'm going to take off these Falcon Wild Peaks, and I'm going to go with a set of Proline 4.19 inch tall KM3 tires, and I've got these mounted onto a set of gold Method 101s from Vanquish. Now the gold is not an available color. I had these custom done when I was having some trophies made, so it was just something that I had done a little special, but overall I think it's going to give it a really cool and unique look. And after a little bit of mock-up, here is my finished result. Now, this body is a difficult one to really work with because it has such a deep interior that really makes you have to move things around. One thing I had to do to fit this particular body, which has this super deep interior, which goes all the way down to the rock sliders, is that I needed to flip the skid plate around to move the spur gear to the back. Now that's a very simple thing, it's just installing it one way or the other. Everything else is the exact same. And that's the orientation that a stock SCX10-II would normally be in. The instructions for the VS4-10 chassis kit actually show installing the skid plate the other way like I originally had it because of things like the optional dig. But since this one, I'm not going to run dig specifically because this body just, to get it sitting low and really looking good, I think, it needed to be in this configuration. Now, if it sat higher and I left the full height of this Lexan body as it was out of the box, I could have ran it the other way, but I really wanted that low look to it. A nice design feature of this VS4-10 chassis kit is that it fills the chassis rails from the very front all the way back to where it ties into the aluminum battery tray. And then the rear chassis brace integrates in that full fuel cell and is one solid piece all the way up to just before the skid plate. Again, this completely fills the frame rails, adding a lot of rigidity. Once you bolt that aluminum battery and electronics tray to the rock sliders, everything just feels like a nice rigid one-piece unit. Another option part that you could add if you like is the VS4-10 Origin inner fenders. Now those are available separately from the body, and you can buy just the inner fenders and then add them to your chassis and then trim them to how you want it to fit your body. It's a nice option for easy inner fenders that are perfectly fit around that aluminum battery tray, the shock towers and everything. It's just much easier than trying to make them by hand or try and design up something to 3D print. They're also much more affordable that way, and they're not going to add much weight. I think I'll probably add those all the way around on this truck just to help enclose everything and make this a nice, clean little scale rig that was extremely simple to put together. Being now that I have a custom body, I may play around with some different bumper options. Again, I can just throw in any stock style SCX10-II bumper or any aftermarket bumper that bolts to the outside of the frame rails. I have a lot of flexibility and a lot of options. I think that you'll find that this kit offers a lot of different axle options and availability for mounting with the increased clearance that it has. It's a perfect chassis if you want to do portal axles but keep something nice and low, or you can use almost any axle on the market and just build links to suit. I plan to do a few other builds just to show you the flexibility that this chassis has with different axle options. So I'm looking forward to getting my newly converted truck back out on the rocks and putting together a few other configurations on this new VS4-10 chassis kit to run alongside it. If you guys have any other questions on setting up the new VS4-10 chassis kit, absolutely drop them in the comments below. If you have other configurations you'd like to see put underneath one of these, absolutely drop those below as well. My plan is to try and use some other OEM style axles underneath as well as some of the other aftermarket options. So with that, guys, thanks for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoy these videos, subscribe if you're not already, hit that notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. Thanks as always, I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you on the next one.